Welcome to our deep dive on sense data. I think this is going to be right up your alley, as a philosopher. Sense data, this concept, has been around for centuries, and it really gets at the core of how we understand perception and reality.
Yeah, it really makes you question how we experience the world. Like, do we directly experience reality, or is there this sort of layer of sensory experience, mediating our perception of objects?
Right, right. So we've got this huge stack of sources here, historical accounts, modern philosophical debates, the whole shebang. So where do we even begin? Maybe for someone who's never heard of sense data, how would you break it down?
Okay, so imagine you're looking at an apple, like a bright red apple. The redness you see, that round shape you perceive, that's the sense data. It's that raw sensory information, like before your brain goes, oh, that's an apple.
Got it. So it's like there's a difference between just seeing that splash of red and actually going, okay, that's an apple.
Yeah.
So separating the experience from actually labeling it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, like philosophically interesting. If all we're immediately aware of is sense data, how do we know there's an actual apple out there? It gets into that whole problem of the external world, something I know you've thought a lot about.
It definitely does. Now, you mentioned that this idea of sense data goes way back. Is this something philosophers have always been grappling with?
Well, the term sense data might be newer, but this idea of, separating sensory impressions from the act of perception, that's been around for ages. Like even Ibn al-Haytham, way back in the 11th century, he was already distinguishing between pure sensation, like light and color, and perception, which involved, recognition and judgment.
Wow, so even way back then, they were already thinking about how our senses connect us to the world.
Yeah, definitely. And you see similar ideas in, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. They may not have used the term sense data, but they were definitely wrestling with this question of like, how do we go from sensory experience to actual knowledge?
And this is where it gets super interesting, right? They're laying the groundwork for this whole huge debate about perception and knowledge that just explodes in the centuries that follow.
Exactly. And their ideas really paved the way for, sense data becoming this specific philosophical term and concept, like in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And two figures who were really key in this shift were William Hamilton and John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, Hamilton. He's a fascinating one. Even though he didn't explicitly use the term sense data, his whole thing with natural realism, it kind of lines up, right? Like he believed we directly perceive the retinal image, which he saw as, a material entity, the immediate object of perception.
And what's really cool about Hamilton, from a philosophical standpoint, is how he tried to, classify different theories of perception. He talked about like sense data theory, which says, okay, sense data is the immediate object of perception versus representative theories, which say there's some kind of representation between the perceiver and the world.
Right. But then you have Mill coming along, and he's pretty critical of Hamilton's method of introspection. He argues that what might seem like this direct, unmediated experience, well, it could actually be the result of, learned associations and habits. Basically, our past experiences are shaping how we perceive things now.
And that's huge, right? Because Mill is anticipating some of the problems that people will have with sense data theory later on. Like, can we ever really isolate pure sensory experience from, what we already know and believe? And it really foreshadows Russell's distinction between like logically and psychologically primitive data, which is a big part of his version of sense data theory.
Okay, so we've got this whole historical context, and then boom, we arrive at the superstars of sense data, Moore and Russell. They really bring this concept to the forefront of philosophy in the early 20th century. What was it about that time period, that the philosophical climate, that made this idea of sense data really take off?
Well, think about it. At that time, idealism, this idea that reality is ultimately mental, that was a huge force in philosophy. Moore and Russell, with their emphasis on sense data, they were part of this swing back towards realism. They wanted to base our knowledge on something concrete, something that could be, objectively verified.
Right, and Moore really dug into this whole distinction between the act of sensation and the object of sensation.
Yeah.
He uses the example of experiencing colors. The act of experiencing is the same, but the colors themselves, those immediate objects of sensation, are distinct.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Moore, he didn't really take a hard stance on what sense data actually are. Like, he explored all these possibilities.
Yeah.
Are they collections of data, products of like a spiritual entity,
Yeah.
manifestations of, things in themselves, representations of objects, or even like parts of the object's surface?
He even uses coins, right,
Yeah.
as an example to talk about perceptual relativity, like how a coin can appear to change shape depending on how you're looking at it, even though the coin itself stays the same.
Yeah, and Moore's struggle with this whole idea of perceptual relativity, it shows how complex and tricky this whole sense data theory is. Like, how do we reconcile these varying subjective experiences with this presumed stability of the physical world? It was something he really grappled with throughout his career.
And what's interesting is how Moore's thinking about this, it actually evolved. He started out arguing that sense data are representations of objects, but later on, he leaned more towards the idea that we're directly perceiving like portions of an object's surface.
And that just goes to show even these brilliant minds, they're constantly wrestling with these big questions about perception and reality. It's always evolving.
Now, Russell, he was really focused on epistemology, right? The
Mm.
study of knowledge.
Mm.
And he uses that famous argument from perceptual variation to argue that, what we see isn't necessarily the object itself, but a series of sensations, those sense data, like a table appearing to change shape as you move around it, even though the table's not actually changing.
That's key, right? He's making this distinction between appearance and reality, which is this theme that runs through like all of philosophy. He's basically saying, look, our perceptions, they might not be giving us this direct line to the true nature of things.
Right, and to really clarify this, he distinguishes between knowledge by acquaintance, which is this direct awareness of sense data, and knowledge by description, which involves, concepts and language. And this all ties into his bigger project of trying to figure out, like, how do we know what we know?
Yeah.
What's the role of universals in knowledge?
Exactly. And then he goes even further. Russell eventually comes to see material objects as like these logical constructions out of sense data. So for him, a table, it's not this fundamental thing on its own, but rather it's built up from our sensory experiences.
So he's saying the world we experience, it's kind of like constructed by our minds.
You could put it that way. And to make things even more wild, he introduces this concept of sensibilia. These are like potential sense data that exist even when no one's perceiving them, like all these possibilities for experiencing an object, even if we only actually experience a few of them.
It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really makes you think about, like, what is the relationship between perception and reality?
Definitely. And Russell's shifting views on sense data, they show how deeply he was thinking about these problems and how willing he was to revise his own theories. And then, to make it even more complicated, he eventually moves towards neutral monism, where both mind and matter are made up of the same basic stuff.
Neutral monism. Now, that sounds like a whole other deep dive just waiting to happen. But for now, let's move on to some of the other key players in this whole sense data saga. We've got so much more to explore.
We do. There's still C.D. Broad and H.H. Price, who really added to this whole complex and evolving conversation.
So we've got Moore and Russell really shaking up the philosophy world with their ideas about sense data. Who else picks up this thread and kind of runs with it?
Well, two figures who come to mind are C.D. Broad and H.H. Price. They were both like really strong advocates for realism, and they really dug deep into this relationship between sense data and the physical world.
Okay, so Broad first. I know he was a big proponent of critical scientific realism. How do his views on sense data fit into that whole picture?
Well, Broad actually preferred the term sensa instead of sense data. He believed that even though we might not be consciously aware of these sensa in our everyday experience, they're always there, kind of underlying our perceptions.
Like they're this hidden foundation for how we see the world.
Exactly. He argued that our belief in the existence of physical objects, it's actually triggered directly by sensing these senses. It's not like we see a bunch of colors and shapes and then logically deduce, oh, there must be a table here.
So it's more like this instant, immediate grasp of the object based on those senses we're perceiving.
Right. And this direct connection between sensa and our belief in physical objects, that's a key part of his critical scientific realism. He saw this belief as like fundamental to how we understand the world, not something we figure out through reasoning.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about H.H. Price? How did his views on sense data kind of line up with Broad's?
Well, Price really dove into this concept of sense data in his book, Perception. He was all about this idea of mental acquaintance with sense data, meaning that we have like this direct and immediate awareness of them. He uses the example of seeing a tomato. Like, you can't really doubt that you're experiencing something, right? That bright red, bulgy shape, even if you're not totally sure it's actually a tomato.
Right, that's a great example. It really shows how sense data just have this undeniable presence in our experience. Whether or not they're actually connected to a real object, like, who knows? But we're definitely experiencing something.
Exactly. And Price was very careful to distinguish between the sense data themselves, which he thought could exist even without any minds to perceive them, and the act of sensing those data, which obviously requires a mind.
So for Price, the sense data are, like, out there in the world, but they only become experiences when a mind comes along and interacts with them.
Exactly. And he argued that our belief in material objects, it doesn't come from inference, but from this process of perceptual acceptance. Like, our minds encounter these sense data, and they naturally grasp the reality of the objects those data seem to represent.
Now, Price is also famous for that whole argument from illusion. I'm guessing that has something to do with sense data, too.
Oh, absolutely. The argument from illusion, it basically points out that we often perceive things that aren't actually as they appear. Like, you know that classic example of a round coin appearing elliptical when you look at it from an angle?
Or like how a straight stick looks bent when it's half underwater.
Right, exactly. So Price argues that since we experience these illusory objects just as directly as we perceive real objects, the immediate objects of perception in both cases have got to be sense data.
So whether it's an illusion, a hallucination, or a real object,
Yeah.
we're always dealing with sense data as the primary objects of our perception.
That's the core of his argument. And he even extends it to include, like, hallucinations, when we perceive things that aren't even there at all.
So for Price, this argument from illusion is like really strong evidence for the existence of sense data. Like it's the foundation of all our perceptual experiences.
Yeah. And it's important to note that Price's work, it was really influential, but it definitely wasn't without its critics. Like A.J. Ayer, he offered a different take on the whole thing. He suggested that this existence of sense data, it might be more of a linguistic convention than a fact.
Oh, interesting. So he's saying that maybe this whole concept of sense data is just a way of talking about our experiences, not necessarily a reflection of something real in the world.
You got it. Ayer thought that different theories of perception, they might use different language to describe experiences, but they can still agree on the basic facts of what we experience. So, one person might say they see an elliptical sense datum when they view a round penny from a weird angle, while another person might say that the penny itself has somehow become elliptical.
So they're both describing the same experience, but using different frameworks to explain it.
Right. And Ayer, he ended up favoring the language of phenomenalism. Basically, talking about physical objects is really just talking about actual and possible sense data. So to talk about a table, you're really talking about this collection of sensory experiences.
That's a pretty radical way of thinking about the relationship between perception and reality. But let's be real, no philosophical concept, especially one as complex as sense data, gets away without some serious criticism. What are some of the main criticisms that have been thrown at this whole theory?
Well, one of the big ones comes from J.L. Austin. He was a philosopher who was really into the subtleties of language. And he argued that this traditional sense data view, the one that says we never directly perceive material objects, only sense data, it's way too simple. It just ignores the richness of our actual experience.
So he had a problem with the way sense data theorists were using terms like illusion, especially when they were talking about these ordinary cases of, perceptual variation, like that coin example we were talking about before.
Right. Austin pointed out that we don't usually call those cases illusions, and he also questioned this whole continuity premise that a lot of sense data arguments rely on. The idea that if one type of perception involves sense data, then all similar perceptions must involve them too.
It sounds like Austin was really emphasizing the importance of everyday language and like common sense understanding when it comes to analyzing these philosophical ideas.
Oh, absolutely. He was basically saying that philosophy shouldn't get too far removed from our actual experience.
Now, there's also this whole sense datum fallacy thing. That's another challenge to sense data theory.
Right. That one focuses on this claim that sense data theorists make a mistake when they jump from saying something appears elliptical to there exists an elliptical sense datum.
So basically, just because something looks a certain way, it doesn't mean there's a separate object that corresponds to that appearance.
Exactly. And this is where these alternative theories of perception come in. Theories that try to explain our experiences without needing these separate sense data.
Like the adverbial analysis and intentionalism.
Yeah, those are two big ones. The adverbial analysis, it says that those qualities we experience, like color and shape, they aren't separate objects, but rather they're part of the act of perceiving itself. So we see the penny, but we see it elliptically. That elliptical shape is a way of seeing, not a thing itself.
Like saying the way we see the penny is affected by our perspective, but the penny itself isn't changing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Intentionalism, that one says that we perceive objects through mental content or representations. So those representations, they can have properties like elliptical or red without the object itself having those properties.
It's like our minds create this internal model of the world based on what we're sensing. And that model might not always perfectly match the reality.
That's the basic idea behind intentionalism. And it's also worth noting that those criticisms of sense data theory, they don't just come from philosophers. Psychologists like William James and those Gestalt psychologists, they had some big issues with it too.
Right. They were more focused on like the big picture of perception, how it's holistic and directed at the world. They argued that we don't experience just these little bits of sense data that we then have to piece together. We just directly perceive a structured world that's full of objects.
Right, and they really emphasize things like size and shape constancy, how we perceive objects as having these stable properties, even as our sensory input is changing. Like, we see a door as rectangular, even when it's open, and the shape on our retina is actually trapezoidal.
It's really cool how these different perspectives challenge this whole foundation of sense data theory.
It is. And then there's Wilfrid Sellars. His critique of the myth of the given was super influential in philosophy. He argued that there's no such thing as these pure, uninterpreted sense experiences. He said our perceptions are always shaped by our concepts, how we understand the world.
So there's no such thing as just pure, raw sensory data.
Yeah.
Our minds are always involved in shaping how we see things.
Precisely. Sellars' work was huge because it challenged this idea that there are these basic, undeniable sense data that are the foundation of all our knowledge.
Okay, so we've got all these criticisms and these alternative theories. So has anyone tried to revive sense data theory in more recent philosophy?
You might be surprised, but yeah, there has been some renewed interest in sense data, though with some interesting twists. Philosophers like Frank Jackson and Howard Robinson have been making arguments for sense data, and they often focus on the idea that sense data are mental.
Oh, that's interesting. How do they make that case, given all the counter-arguments we just talked about?
Well, Jackson, for instance, he argues that colors are mental because they're not scientific properties. He says that science deals with physical stuff, and color can't be explained just in terms of physics, so it has to be mental.
That's a pretty bold claim. It seems like it relies on this clear division between mental and physical stuff, which is, a whole other can of worms philosophically.
Oh, definitely. It's a controversial view, and not everyone agrees with Jackson's reasoning. Robinson, on the other hand, he takes a different approach. He points to the time lag involved in, perceiving distant objects like stars. It takes years for the light from those stars to reach us, so we're seeing them as they were in the past, maybe even when they don't even exist anymore.
So he's using the vastness of space and how light travels to argue for sense data.
Yeah, he says this time lag means that what we're perceiving has got to be sense data, not the objects themselves. Like, our perception is always trying to catch up to reality.
That's a really interesting argument. And I know Robinson also uses hallucinations to make a case for sense data.
Right. He says that if we can have experiences of things that aren't actually there, then there's got to be something else we're perceiving, and that's the sense data.
It's a pretty clever way to use those, unusual perceptual experiences to argue for sense data.
It is. And Robinson's work is particularly interesting because he actually suggests that his arguments for sense data, they might actually support idealism more than realism. So maybe the world we perceive is really a construction of our minds and not this mind-independent reality.
Wow. So even though sense data theory has faced a lot of challenges, it sounds like the conversation is far from over.
Not at all. And, even though sense data might not be as dominant as it once was, it's definitely shaped how we think about perception and knowledge. It made us realize that the mind plays an active role in shaping how we experience things, and it forced us to really grapple with this whole relationship between appearance and reality.
I get the sense that there's still so much more to explore here. What other directions have people taken this whole debate about sense data?
Well, one interesting development is this idea of naturalized sense data, which tries to bring together this concept of immediate sensory experience with the belief that we directly perceive objects in the world.
Oh, so it's like trying to bridge the gap between these two seemingly opposing views.
It is. This theory says that while we directly perceive these three-dimensional objects, we only immediately perceive that part of their surface that we can actually see at any given moment.
So it's like we get this glimpse of the object through its surface, and our minds are able to fill in the rest and understand the whole object from that.
Exactly. It's trying to find some middle ground between that traditional sense data theory and the more direct realist views.
But I bet even this approach has its critics.
Of course. Like, how does it deal with the breakdown of shape constancy when things are far away and they start to look distorted? And how does it explain color as a property of a surface without bringing in those mental factors? These are just some of the things naturalized sense data theory still needs to address.
Sounds like the quest to really understand perception and how it relates to the world is still ongoing.
Oh, for sure. It really shows how powerful these questions are. We're still trying to understand how we experience and know the world around us.
Man, we've really been through it, huh?
Right.
All these philosophical debates about how we perceive the world. It's amazing how this concept of sense data, from ancient times to now, it's just created so many questions and different interpretations.
Yeah, it really has. And even if we can't definitively say whether sense data actually exist or, what they're like, just thinking about this whole concept has been so valuable.
So for you, as a philosopher, what do you think are the most important things we've learned from all these debates? What's the legacy of this whole sense data idea, even if some people disagree with the specifics?
I think one of the biggest contributions is that it forced philosophers to really look at the problem of perception. Like, it challenged this simple idea that we just see the world as it is, no complications.
It's like sense data kind of revealed this whole hidden process of how we experience and understand the world.
Exactly. And it made us think, hey, maybe our perceptions aren't always accurate or reliable. And that has huge implications for how we think about knowledge, how we justify our beliefs, and really, like, the limits of what we can know.
Right. It gets into those big epistemological questions. If we're not directly in touch with reality, but is all filtered through these maybe unreliable sense data, then how can we be sure of anything?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Philosophers have been wrestling with that one for centuries. And sense data theory, it might not give us all the answers, but it definitely makes us think harder about how we justify what we believe.
It also makes you wonder about the relationship between our minds and the world. Does this whole sense data thing mean that the world we see is really just something our minds create?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. It gets to the heart of this whole realism versus idealism debate. Some philosophers, like Robinson, they argue that sense data actually support idealism, that what we perceive is really just mental stuff.
Whoa, that's a pretty wild thought. To think that the world we experience might just be like a projection of our minds.
It definitely goes against our common sense, right? But even if we don't go full-on idealist, thinking about sense data has made us realize that our minds are actively involved in shaping how we see things.
So it's not just this passive process of information coming in. We're actually like co-creators of our own experience.
That's it. And this idea, it has implications for how we understand not just perception, but also things like concepts, language, even consciousness itself.
So even if that classic sense data theory isn't, super popular in philosophy today, it's definitely had a lasting impact.
It really has. And it's good to remember that philosophy, it's not always about finding the right answer. It's about asking the right questions.
Yeah.
Looking at things from different angles and really trying to push the limits of our understanding. And in that way, sense data theory has given us so much to think about.
I agree. This whole journey into the world of sense data, it doesn't end here. It's like an invitation to keep questioning, to keep learning, and to keep digging deeper into the mysteries of our minds and how they connect with the world.
It definitely is.
Well, thanks for taking us on this incredible adventure. It's been amazing. Until next time.